All right. So what we're going to do today is we're going to take a look at the Buddha, as well as some kind of general sort of frameworks that we need to understand when we talk about Buddhism as a whole. So hopefully you've watched the documentary on the life of the Buddha, and that will give you a really good sense of the person, right, that we're talking about, at least as sort of developed according to Buddhist scripture and then kind of later traditions. And uh, and we're going to see then how this individual, Siddhartha Gautama, who becomes the Buddha, how he fits within this sort of broader framework of the religion and the philosophy and the tradition that we call Buddhism. Buddhism is developed throughout history, as well as Buddhism as we find it today. And so I think there's always that sort of question about Buddhism as such and its relationship, right, with this historical figure, Siddhartha Gautama. Um, what is that relationship? And when each of these traditions, these sort of various Buddhist traditions, talk about the Buddha, right? Like, what are they, or who are they referring to? Like, who is this individual they're referring to? Is it the historical sort of figure, right, or is it something else? And I think this and what claims are kind of made about the historicity and so forth of this individual. Um, so, of course, these are questions that are incredibly difficult to answer, and provide a lot of material for discussion. But I think it's worth thinking about that in connection with the way the tradition understands the relationship to the Buddha, right? And so, of course, we can sort of take an apparently objective sort of view and sort of study kind of different forms of Buddhism as a phenomena, as a sort of a cultural development, and so on. Right, but I'm also and perhaps more interested in how each of these traditions themselves, right, think about this individual, the Buddha, right? What role does the individual sort of play into in this discussion, right, or in this sort of thinking, and in the kind of lived experience of a Buddhist, right? Like, what is that? We'll talk later about um, what are called the three refuges, right? And if you think about kind of like what the process of becoming a Buddhist looks like, it's this sort of process of it's this sort of act of taking the refuges, the three refuges. And what these are is, I take refuge in the Buddha, I take refuge in the Dharma, and I take refuge in the Sangha, right? And we'll talk about what each of these are, right? The Dharma, just in a general sense, is the teachings of the Buddha. The Sangha is the community of Buddhists, right? But this first refuge, right, to take refuge in the Buddha, right? What does that mean to sort of take refuge in the Buddha? And each tradition will understand this first refuge in a different sort of way. And so I want us to sort of dwell on this a little bit, um, and come back to it. That all of these sort of very diverse traditions continue to sort of go back to these three refuges, right? But are they talking about the same thing in each sort of context? So, so we'll start today by looking at the life of the Buddha a little bit. I just kind of want to highlight things that I think will continue to be important. And all of this, right, will be review from the documentary, and then we'll spend some time looking at Buddhism in general, kind of what Buddhism is. This is sort of like sociology of religion, I suppose, right? Like kind of where it's at, and then uh, we'll spend a little bit of time looking at one form of Buddhism, because this particular form of Buddhism will be where our readings for the first half of the course will be coming from. And so we'll be focusing a bit on that. Um, so so let's go ahead and share the screen. Okay. So again, about the kind of life of the Buddha, just want to say a few things. I'm just highlighting a few sort of parts. And in doing so, of course, what is the relevance of this life, right? In terms of the path of someone who engages in Buddhism, right? What's the relationship between the life of the Buddha and the path itself, right? Is the teachings of the Buddha, right? As we'll talk about the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, the doctrine of self or non-self, and so on, right? Right? Do those sit independent of the Buddha himself, right? Or is understanding the story of the Buddha an important part of the teachings as well, right? The life and story. And I guess I'll say, I mean, I think so. I think that the way the story of the Buddha has been incorporated into Buddhist understandings of what it means to be Buddhist, right? I think that life and story are quite important when it comes to understanding what Buddhism is. And I think that there's, if we look at other traditions, particularly religious traditions, but even some philosophical schools of thought, right? The life, the way we live our lives, and the life of maybe a founder of a particular tradition or school, right, can be quite important. Of course, kind of in the West, in the United States, the tradition that comes to mind, right, is going to be Christianity, and that is a sort of a perfect example of a place where um, kind of the life of Jesus, right, becomes very important to an understanding of Christianity, right? Um, and and I think that we find this also in some sort of philosophical traditions. We talk about kind of the life of Socrates, right? And he kind of lived out a particular sort of way of of being in the world, right? And I think some others have emphasized this to some degree, right? When we get to the 19th and 20th century, we see people like Nietzsche and Kierkegaard. I think the existentialists really focus on this idea quite a bit as well. Um, uh, the life, in some sense, is a living out of the teaching, right? You could certainly study something like Christianity, or you could study Socrates, or you could study existentialism just based on a kind of teachings or doctrine or whatever, right? But 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 it seems that there might be something missing, and I think in Buddhism, we could study just the sort of the teachings of the Buddha, right? But it seems that there might be something missing if we don't also look at the life. And the reason that's important is because it becomes, at least in Buddhism, right? In the case of Buddhism, the reason that becomes important is because we can then identify, right? We can sort of look at certain sort of moments in the life of the Buddha and kind of relate to those moments. You can say, hey, like I've experienced something similar, right? It becomes kind of an analogy or a metaphor for our own lives, and we can recognize. And of course, this all points sort of in a philosophical context to sort of questions of truth and questions of knowledge and kind of what truth and knowledge are. Right? What's our sort of access to truth? What's our access to um, to to knowledge? Um, okay, so um, so what are the key moments, right? Where when we sort of look at Buddhism, uh, or excuse me, look at the life of the Buddha, what are the key moments that will become important? And I start here. This is an image that is intended to depict what are called the Jataka tales, right? And the Jataka tales, Jataka, are stories, and these were written after the death of the Buddha, probably 100, 200 years after the death of the Buddha, right? And so that in terms of when they were written or when they were developed, they come a little bit later, um, but but they depict the period before the birth of the Buddha. So we'll talk about, we mentioned with Hinduism and in Buddhism, there's also a belief in rebirth, right? That this is not our first or last life on this planet. And so the Jataka tales are supposed to be about the earlier lives of the Buddha. And these earlier lives are not just human lives, but also, experiences as animals and so on. And these are really, I think we would probably categorize them or sort of think of them as fables, right? That's kind of how kind of in Western literature, right? That they would be very similar to sort of fables. They give sort of a moral, right? You sort of read them. Sometimes the figure of the Buddha, or the one who will become the Buddha, right? In a future life, here in this context, referred to as a bodhisattva, a very complicated term that we'll spend much more time on when we get to Mahayana Buddhism. But in this context, it means a future Buddha, right? In this other context, it means something slightly different, related, but slightly different. But this bodhisattva, or this future Buddha, kind of, is always sort of is sort of has a lot of wit, and usually is sort of the story, at least, is sort of developing some sort of important moral or way to live our life, kind of wisdom, right? It teaches us that sort of thing, and so we have these Jataka tales, and I point that out, here, just to sort of show the sort of richness of Buddhist literature, right? So it's, when you begin to read these sort of sutras, these sort of the scriptures of Buddhism, right? You might get the sense that like there's kind of this one way of engaging with Buddhist literature, but I think that more broadly, right, we can see that Buddhist literature is very rich. So those are the Jataka tales. So the as you saw, right, in the video, right, the sort of story of how the Buddha was conceived. This is an image of that. Again, a place where we can kind of think about kind of the role of these very sort of miraculous sort of moments, right, where we see the miracle of the conception of the Buddha, right, and we have that story of the elephant moving into the side of Siddhartha's mother, and that is how Siddhartha was conceived, and then of course here we have the birth scene, where if you see there the side of Siddhartha's mother, a little Buddha essentially coming out the side, but again, these, and if you're sort of not Buddhist, and you're sort of reading through these, I think it's still important to think about the role that these sort of stories play in the tradition of Buddhism, right? That this tradition is sort of filled with these elements, and these elements are going to always be in tension with the idea or the importance of understanding Siddhartha as a human being that experiences, desire, experiences attachment, and wants to be free of pain and suffering, right? So we have an important sort of tension that is going on. Again, might be sort of interesting in sort of making comparisons with other traditions on this point. So just to sort of locate where Buddhism developed and where Siddhartha was born. If you look there on kind of the northeastern side of India, up near Nepal, along the mountains there, you'll see kind of faintly written Sakya, right? And so that's the area the Sakya clan was the clan that the Buddha's father, right, was a king in. You probably see the Sravasti, Kosala, like all those are very important regions and places in the history of Buddhism, right? So people who kind of do go on pilgrimages, right, will visit these places. But anyway, so the Sakya, that's where Buddha came from. Um, Sometimes he's referred to as Sakya Muni, um, which means the sage of the Sakyas, um, and both India and Nepal, kind of claim to be the location of the birth of the Buddha, and but right there on the border, right? So that's sort of important to sort of locate where uh, where Buddhism arose from, where it developed from. The birth, right? We get these 32 signs. We're not going to go through all of them. One of those was that that Siddhartha at birth had a wheel imprinted on his foot. So sometimes you'll see these depicted with these footprints of the Buddha that show a wheel kind of in the middle, often called the wheel of the Dharma. Sometimes it has the 8 spokes to indicate or to symbolize the Eightfold Path, right? But we get these various signs. Why these were important, if you remember in the story, is that there were, uh, soon after Siddhartha was born, Siddhartha's father, and you remember that Siddhartha's mother dies very early, but Siddhartha's father has a number of seers and astrologers and others, right, who sort of predict the future, come and kind of read these signs, right? What are the importance of these signs? What's the importance of the moment of the birth, and so on, right? Trying to figure this all out. And the conclusion, right, that is sort of given is that, like, your son will become either a great political ruler, right, or a great spiritual leader. And much of the literature talks about how at this point, right, Siddhartha sort of stood up, right, as a baby and walked, and said that this is his last life. When he says this is the last life, means he's going to overcome the problem of birth, death, and rebirth, right? This is the big problem within Indian religion, is sort of the cycle of birth and death and rebirth. So it's really saying, I will achieve salvation, right? So if you think about salvation within this context of Indian religion and philosophy and so on, right? It's overcoming that problem of rebirth, of constant rebirth. And so he's going to overcome that. So he's sort of indicating one direction, but not the direction that his father wants him to take. And so what does his father do? His father raises him in such a way that he doesn't experience any pain, doesn't experience any suffering, or at least tries to, right? Of course, it's an impossibility, as we'll see that sort of Buddhism claiming that's an impossibility, but tries to do that. And then sort of gives every possible pleasure, to Siddhartha, the young Siddhartha, and sort of grows up in this environment of really being sort of handled with absolute care, right? Why? Well, because Siddhartha's father was wise enough to know that the experience of suffering can lead to spiritual, religious sort of transformation, right? And so he wanted to prevent that possibility from happening. And so, and part of that, right, is that Siddhartha's father ensured that he would that Siddhartha would find a spouse, and begin a family, believing that would ensure that Siddhartha would not sort of move on. And so Siddhartha um, begins a family, right? Marries and has a child, um, but he also begins um, around the time of having a child, right? To question his sort of life in the palace, right? Being raised to be a ruler, being raised to be a prince, being um, and and so he becomes curious, right? So he asks his charioteer to take him out for these various outings, which you saw depicted in the documentary, where he sees on four different outings someone who is sort of old, someone who is sick, right, and a corpse, somebody who has died, and he begins to recognize the sort of shock being outside, seeing something that, of course, he knew about, right? I mean, it wasn't as though he kind of lacked knowledge of sickness and death and old age and so on, right? But he didn't hadn't experienced it, and so he saw it with his eyes, right? This sort of the sense experience of this becomes important, right, for the young. Well, at this point, less young, right? He's in his late 20s by this point, right? But he sees this, and then he sees a wandering ascetic, a monk, somebody who is trying to find a way out of this path, or this sort of life of suffering, right? Um, Trying to find a solution, trying to find salvation, right? And so he begins to commit himself or develop the resolution that he too is going to find a way out of suffering. And he doesn't believe that he can do this at the palace, engaged in the life um, of a prince, right? That he must leave everything behind, um, of course, including not just um, his princely duties and his life with his father and so on, right? But his own family, his wife, and his who at this point is a 1-year-old child, right? And so we see the young, or again, the late 30s, Siddhartha leaving the palace behind. Uh, a very difficult sort of moment, and I think a moment that is hard really to make a sort of clear sense of, to know kind of what to sort of do with it, because we have this is sort of the moment of Siddhartha sort of first taking kind of the steps on his path towards enlightenment. But in that moment, he's leaving those who he loves and love him um, behind in order to pursue this. Right? I'm not going to provide a resolution. Of course, this is something that uh, uh, you know requires one to sort of think about on their own. Um, but it's part of the story. Right? So he leaves with Chana. This is an image of Siddhartha cutting his hair off. Be taking on the robes of a wandering ascetic uh, there on the banks of the river. Sends back his clothes and his hair with Chana to his saying, give this to my father. And he begins the life of a wandering monk. And he begins first, or wandering ascetic, and he begins first by looking for teachers. He spends time with a couple of these teachers, and they each give him sort of instruction, largely in meditation, right? And he develops sort of deep abilities in these various forms of meditation. Right? But he finds that even with that, he's not able to sort of overcome the big problem, right? The big problem of suffering in the world, right? And in himself. And so he then decides to give up these teachings and say, well, suffering, at least large parts of suffering, seem to come about because of attachment to the body. And so he goes through this sort of radical asceticism, uh, sort of often talk about sort of a punishing of the body, right? Of fasting, but kind of extreme fasting, right? For long periods, no food, um, subjecting the body to sort of extremes in terms of heat, um, and sort of exposure to kind of the world, right? And he has a number of followers, right, that go with him and practice with him. But he brings himself to nearly the point of death, and he realizes that, like, I haven't overcome suffering. And at this point, um, there was a young woman who offered him some rice porridge, um, and and he decides to take it. Right, he decides to essentially give up the path of asceticism, and this becomes the first teaching of Buddhism, right? Which is the middle way, the middle path, um, and that essentially can't have the strength to pursue what he's seeking, um, if he totally denies kind of all pleasure, right? And so the idea here is learning a type of moderation. Um, this is an important, I think, sort of um, teaching we find in again a number of traditions. I think we see this with Aristotle. Uh, I think we see discussions of this in people like Augustine, right? But trying to sort of navigate this place, right, where kind of overindulging in pleasures, right, can lead to a place um, of stagnation, right? But total denial of the needs of the body, right, which are wrapped up in pleasures, right? Eating, right? We enjoy eating, wrapped up in pleasures, leads to sort of weakness, and so for our own sort of strength, right, we need to um, engage in these things in sort of moderation, he would say. He uses this sort of analogy, right, with a or metaphor with kind of tuning an instrument, stringed instrument, where if the string is too lax, right, it doesn't play. If it's too tight, the string breaks, and so we need this uh, sort of moderation in tautness. So this becomes the first teaching, and then he commits to sitting under the Bodhi tree. Right, this was all depicted. This sort of battle with Mara is depicted in the documentary, right? But of course, a personification of desire, personification of those things, ignorance and aversion as well, right? Those things that lead to suffering, sources of suffering, and he has to overcome these. And he does this while sitting under this Bodhi tree, of course, called that now because of it being the tree the type of tree that Siddhartha was sitting under, but a type of fig tree. Sits under the tree until he's able to overcome all of these sort of desires that present themselves, and he sits, allowing these things to wash over him until he's settled down and he's free of them, right? Um, becomes non-attached to them. And so, and of course, we see this sort of moment of that depicted here with the Buddha, and we can call him sort of formally the Buddha at this point, right? The awakened one, when Marav gives him this sort of final challenge, right? Fine, right? Perhaps you overcome all this desire or whatever, right? But who is going to be a witness, right? This sort of final temptation that no one's even going to believe you and care, right? It's all meaningless. And he reaches down, he touches the earth. He says, the earth will be my witness. Right. And so when you see images or sort of statues of the Buddha, the hand touching the ground like that, right? That's the key to that, right? Is that it's the moment of enlightenment. It's the touching of the ground as the witness. Um, so then the Buddha now begins his sort of life career of teaching. He first goes back to the five ascetics who were initially very skeptical of him because he'd given up the life of asceticism, but he wins them over, teaches them the Eightfold Path, the Four Noble Truths, and they become the first monks. And he continues to teach and gather a large following, the Sangha, right, the community of monks around him. He goes back home. His son Rahula becomes a monk, and his stepmother also becomes a follower, becomes a monk, the woman that had raised him. We'll talk about her in a bit. And so he spends his life into his 80s teaching, overcome the cycle of birth and death, and at his sort of what's called the parinirvana, which is the nirvana at death, he gives the final teaching of, I've explained the Dharma to you, right? He says, but you must now go and work out your own salvation. So the Buddha, after death, according to the tradition, does not come back and is not reborn, right? Other traditions will talk about kind of what the state of the Buddha is at this point, right? But at least the Theravada tradition we're talking about says that this is the end of the cycle of birth and death for Siddhartha. Okay, so just wanted to highlight the sort of elements because I think these become important. They're touchstones for things we'll talk about throughout. So, and think about kind of what you struggle with. You know, if you're sort of doing a journal on this or whatever, right? Thinking about things that maybe were sort of interesting or things that were difficult in that. What's the relationship right between suffering, the question of suffering, and the life of the Buddha? And as we talk over the next few weeks, maybe plugging in the teachings to this life, right? Kind of where does this teaching come from? How does the life illustrate this idea? Okay, so what I want to do now is just spend a little bit of time talking about the sort of Buddhism in the world today, and then sort of zeroing in on one tradition of that. So the three main traditions within modern Buddhism today, is Theravada Buddhism, which we'll be talking more about today. And then we have two other forms that are closely related, Mahayana and Vajrayana Buddhism. Mahayana, the word Mahayana just means large vehicle, which is a focus on the salvation of all sentient beings. So we'll spend the second half of the class looking at Zen, and Zen is a form of Mahayana Buddhism, but there are another number of other forms. And the role of the Bodhisattva becomes very important, which we'll talk about later. And then Vajrayana, which sometimes is a kind of sub-school or tradition of Mahayana Buddhism, sometimes separated, but this is Tibetan Buddhism. Right? So the Buddhism of Tibet is Vajrayana, called the Thunderbolt school, right? meaning it's sort of the using skillful means to quickly move the person to enlightenment, right? What methods can we use to bring us there? Um, so again, this tradition more or less accepts what we find in Mahayana, but has other elements that are particular to it. Okay, so we're going to focus then on, this is just a map to show where each of these forms of Buddhism exist. Really, the three colors to be paying attention to, or the three areas, I guess I should say, to be paying attention to, would be the area that's in red, right, which is Theravada Buddhism. The areas that are yellow and green, both of these are going to be forms of Mahayana Buddhism. And then the areas that are blue, right? So those would be Tibetan Buddhism. And so what we see there is, kind of the Southeast Asia. Much of that is Theravada Buddhism, except for Vietnam. And we'll, of course, you're already getting a taste of that, right? Where Thich Nhat Hanh comes from. He's certainly a Zen Buddhist, so part of the Mahayana tradition. So Vietnam, the rest there of Southeast Asia is largely Theravada Buddhist, as well as you can see Sri Lanka right there off the coast of India. And then we have, China, Japan, Korea, where we see Mahayana Buddhism. So again, the yellow and the green, and then finally the blue is Tibetan Buddhism. So you see Tibet there, as well as Mongolia. Right? And just to point out the pink, the Dalit Buddhism, right? So a form of Buddhism that is intended as a kind of counter to the caste system, right? So particularly focused on that, and Dalit forms of Buddhism are sort of interesting and very complicated, and don't fit very easily within these other discussions of Buddhism, but certainly an interesting phenomena to see there within India. All right, so we'll focus then on Theravada Buddhism. So again, the Buddhism of like Thailand, of Burma or Myanmar, of Cambodia, of Sri Lanka. This form of Buddhism, and the word Theravada means like school of the elders, and it considers itself, the way it sees itself is sort of holding the oldest traditions within Buddhism. When we look at Mahayana Buddhism, we'll see another tradition that was quite ancient, that is very similar to Mahayana Buddhism today, right? And so certainly in the early forms of Buddhism, there were alternative schools, but this is the one that continued on in more or less uninterrupted fashion. And so there's sort of a commitment to what it sees as the original and kind of pure form of Buddhism within the Theravada tradition. Right, so we sort of see there the various places that we find Theravada. It emphasizes the importance of monasticism, right? Monasticism is very core to it. It doesn't reject kind of a lay path when I say lay, right, so non-monastic path of Buddhism, but it prioritizes monasticism. Some places seem to indicate, right, monasticism is the only way, but I think that is there's certainly evidence very contrary to that within the early Buddhist texts, and the language and the canon, the writings, right, are preserved in Pali, right? This sort of ancient language that these texts were first written down in. Right, this is sort of historically, arises from the Indian king Ashoka, who ensured that all these were preserved properly in the Pali language. Right, so there you can see his name, King Ashoka, and the dates 304 to 232, and a very important figure, particularly in Theravada Buddhism, a time when India was largely Buddhist, right? It's no longer the case, but at one time it was, and in some ways we can see Sri Lanka as the kind of the survival of that form of Buddhism that existed in India, and the tradition says that the canon, right, the scriptures were preserved at the first council, soon after the death of the Buddha, in which 500 sort of core monks came together and recited the canon, and there were sort of different figures that were present that sort of expressed different components of it, and then it was memorized, and then it continued to be passed down, very much in the same way that we see with the Vedas, right? It was sort of passed down orally before eventually being written. And we see that it was, many hundred years later before it was actually written fully in Sri Lanka. I'm sorry, I may have said that it was written under Ashoka, but the Pali, right, became the core language under Ashoka, but it was not written until 25 or so BCE, and these scriptures are studied in Pali today, right? So they continue to be studied in that language. So in terms of the different components of the scriptures, right, there are three what are called baskets. The Pitaka means basket, so the T means triple, right? Of course, a cognate with our word for triple in the Sanskrit, right? We get the R even, right? So the Tripitaka, so the tri. So the three baskets include the Sutta Pitaka or Sutra Pitaka. Right, again, another cognate there with sutta or sutra with our word suture, to sew up. The Vinaya Pitaka, which is the rules, right? So think of kind of the monastic rules here. And then the Abhidhamma Pitaka, which is the kind of the philosophical, sort of psychological, very abstract way of kind of rendering the teachings into lists and sort of various rubrics and so on. So we're going to be focusing in our discussions on the Sutta Pitaka, right? Because these are the sayings. This is the sort of everyday engaged sort of teachings of the Buddha on various topics. So we can see here, one of the renderings and these stupas of the entire Pali canon inside. This is what you would find. Okay, another important, so we got the scripture. The scripture is very important for Theravada Buddhism, sort of being sort of devoted to the correct sayings of the Buddha. The next thing is monasticism, right? And um, and both there are monastic communities of both women and men. Um, the word bhikkhu or bhukini, right, are the words that are normally see for for monk or nun. You have to be 8 years old, right? And there's a kind of a historical reason for that. That's supposedly the age that Rahula was, the son of the Buddha, when he went back home, when the Buddha went back home, and Rahula became a monk. Um, and there are sort of kind of movements and different um, sort of retreat periods that are historically based on kind of the rainy seasons and so on. And there's kind of a move back and forth between kind of mobility and settling based on various seasons, at least traditionally. Um, you see the monks here, these young monks, right? Sort of having the possessions that a monk is allowed, right? They give everything up but their robes and their begging bowl, right? And so we have here um, these young monks with their two possessions, and the begging bowl, of course, is important because this is how the monks eat, right? That they gain their sustenance through going out and begging for food each day, and they can't sort of possess anything, at least traditionally, beyond that. The reason for monasticism, right? It's a place for teaching, preserving the Dharma, and seeking enlightenment for the individual monks, and it's a place of teaching of the Dharma, right, to the community, and so we can think of the relationship being one of support in two ways, right? That the community, the lay community, supports the monastery by giving alms, and the community, the monastery supports the lay community by teaching, by providing these dharma talks and so on. Generally, the leadership of a monastery is based on some form of vote, either by the monastics or all of the Buddhists in a particular area. And as I said, there's sort of a process of of, of retreats that follow the early rainy seasons that the Buddha had to follow. Um, oh, and of course, the sort of scholarly importance of a monastery, right? Think of a time when, kind of sort of research and scholarship were not common amongst, most people, and places like monasteries became sort of literary hubs, right? Places where you had people that were literate and engaged in reading and writing and so on, right? And so monasticism played an important role in the cultural, intellectual sort of aspects of the community as well. I do want to point out Mahapajapati. So Mahapajapati Gotami, hopefully you recognize that name Gotami. So like Gotama, this is the stepmother, the aunt, his father's sister, the Buddha's father's sister, but stepmother of the Buddha, and she became a follower of Siddhartha, of the Buddha, and developed a following of her own of women who wanted to take vows and become a part of the monastic community. And the story here is important, kind of in the history of Buddhism, where the Buddha initially said no, right? You cannot. And it was only after multiple tries and the intervention of Ananda, the Buddha's close attendant, who basically said to the Buddha, like, "Hey, like, is it possible for a woman to become enlightened?" And the Buddha says, "Well, yeah." He's like, "Well, then why can women not become monastics, right?" And um, so kind of the combined efforts of Mahapajapati and Ananda opened up Buddhism, the monastic communities, to women, right? But this is not without some struggle and some sort of pushback and resistance on the part of the Buddha. And so kind of her role is sort of central to the early invitation of to women to sort of follow the path. Um, there's some sort of interesting things that occur here, including the women receiving a number of additional rules to their life in the Vinaya Pitaka that we talked about. So there are 53 more rules, at least in the Pali version. And some of these, right, are things like um, a nun who has been ordained even 100 years must respectfully rise up from her seat, salute, join palms, and do homage to a monk ordained but a day. Right? So the idea that women must always do homage to men, right? So this becomes, of course, an important sort of place of of tension and difficulty um, as, throughout the history of Buddhism. We see this not just in Theravada Buddhism, but we see the same sort of tensions showing up in different ways, right? But in other forms of Buddhism as well. Um, but I did want to highlight Mahapajapati for a moment. Uh, Okay. Lay community, as I mentioned, right, supports the monastics through almsgiving, which we see going on here. The way that alms sort of work is the monks will go out, bake for food, and return to the monastery, and then share what they have received, right, sort of communally. Um, and there's a real attempt here to show interdependence between these two communities, between the monastic and the lay community. And this this also, right, sort of historically has been important in establishing monasteries where sort of powerful and wealthy um, um, lay Buddhists would provide land, places for the monasteries to be developed. Okay. And then I also want to point out, and we'll talk about this when we get to the precepts and get to the Eightfold Path and some other places, because there can be a tendency to sort of, at least in Theravada Buddhism, to really emphasize monasticism at the expense of lay practice, and many of the dialogues, most of the dialogues, right, are with uh, kind of monastic practitioners. But it's not that the Buddha did not consider the importance of the lay community too, right? And so we see this throughout in a number of the sutras um, where there are sort of important uh, teachings for the lay community, including the encouragement for those in the lay community to seek enlightenment. Um, so, uh, so I do want to sort of point out that the it can sometimes feel, right, when we're reading these, that like this sort of the lay community gets kind of dropped or secondary in importance. Uh, but but um, the Buddha did spend significant time sort of considering uh, on the questions, but not to say there's not attention, right? So um, so hopefully that gives you a taste, right, of kind of what this form of Buddhism is, Theravada Buddhism, which we'll be focusing on for the first, again, half or so of the class. And then we're going to take this shift to Mahayana Buddhism later. And so we'll spend some more time developing what those ideas are there. And so after this, we'll jump into the teachings themselves. So I look forward to those discussions as we move forward.